expand the vast unknown. And this new life is cast.
Without further ado, I'm going to bring up our next panel. From domination to partnerism, building a regenerative social system. And so we have Susanna Choe, we have my friend Rosie Von Lila, and behind me, Ashoka Finley. So hey, take it away, y'all.
Oh, great. Thank you both for being here. So good to see you both. And I really appreciate your willingness to spontaneously join this conversation as it emerged over the last 24 hours. Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation with you, Rosie, considering that you have been so instrumental in shaping the culture of Burning Man with your participatory framework as an advisor to Burning Man. And I would love for you and Ashoka to both introduce yourselves, because you're two of the most dynamic people I've met who've done so many different things throughout your career. But to get started, I will give a brief introduction of you, Rosie. And I think this is such a pertinent time to have this discussion about how the culture of Burning Man is being applied to the world outside of Burning Man, as the world is kind of collapsing and we have this blank canvas to co-create what the world could look like. And as burners ourselves and people who have really experienced Burning Man, I think it's our duty almost to embody the principles that we've learned at the playa and take it out into the world. And Ashoka has been, building like the scaffolding that Seth and Roxy and Damien were referring to earlier for creators to participate and contribute to building the world that we believe in. So to get started, Rosie Von Lila, thank you for being here. Rosie is passionate about governance, public policy, and economics. She works in finance and previously worked for Burning Man headquarters. She's considered a Burning Man historian and co-created the cultural attaché training program with Burning Man Education. She has been to the playa 19 times and has been part of the community for 21 years. Wow. Based on her work with Burning Man, she wrote a framework for stakeholder engagement. She has a podcast called What Comes Now, which is available on all major podcast platforms. She's on Twitter at Rosie Von Lila. Rosie, if you want to maybe introduce yourself a little bit further.
I'd be happy to. And Susanna, thanks for having me. And Ashoka, it's good to be on stage with you again. Ashoka was on a panel that I led at South by Southwest for Burning Man about 5 years ago, and that session was on building participatory cities. So here we are again.
Yeah.
So I live in New York. I'm originally from California. I made the jump from Burning Man to Wall Street, and I now work in finance. I'm an executive in finance. And as Susanna shared, I'm really passionate about policy and economics. That's how we fundamentally shift things in this country. I'm deeply involved with the work of an iconic woman named Riane Eisler, who is the mother of Partnerism, which is a new movement that is post-capitalism and post-Marxism. So I'm excited to share a little bit about that tonight. And I'll leave it there until we continue.
Thank you, Rosie. Ashoka, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Ashoka Finley, from California, currently in California. Definitely feel like an alien sometimes. But my focus is specifically on logistical systems. I studied political economy, so I think a lot about how to keep society running, and specifically the impact that systems like food, energy, housing, water, and how we relate to those resources affect our relationship with the natural and more than human world. And yeah, just building a new platform called Tollo right now, which is all about giving people content about the world that we are building together, but also doing really deep radical strategy, like eliminating rent and building and buying farms and energy systems that can provide nourishment to people. So excited to be here, excited to talk. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. No big deal, just eliminating rent. Yeah, these two are up to some really big stuff in the world, and I'm so grateful to be able to call you both friends and mentors and allies in this lifelong mission. Guess we'll get started with what you appreciate most about Burning Man and what your experiences there has taught you, considering that the theme of the day is about the next decade of Burning Man. And would love to hear what your takeaways were and how you're applying that to the real world.
Do you want to go first? Because you've gone 19 more times than I've gone.
It's not 19 more. You've been, right?
Oh, right, 18 more. I didn't know if that number had been updated. Okay, so yeah, just 18 more, exactly.
Okay, gosh, let's see. Burning Man has always given me a platform to experiment, to try new things in myself. And I always say that it is a place where you can be whomever you want to be. And so in that, I've developed a genuine self-expression. And it's been really amazing working in finance. Like the work that I do now is worlds away from the work that I used to do at Burning Man headquarters. I wear a suit every day, and I go and I meet with public pensions, and I talk with leaders who control trillions of dollars, and we do advocacy work on behalf of women and diverse investment managers. And so this is all about transforming our society by making access to capital more available to people who have historically been marginalized. And so I've been really amazingly, I was inspired by Arlen Hamilton, who is a Black queer venture capitalist in Los Angeles. She started a firm called Backstage Capital that invests in women and people of color and LGBTQ entrepreneurs. And she's all about authenticity. And through reading her work and watching her interviews and getting to interview her on my podcast, I really awakened to the fact that I had been separating business Rosie from Burning Man self-expressed Rosie. And now this year, I've been in this process of merging those two and really genuinely letting my artistic personality come out in my work. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that Burning Man has taught me. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons that people get to learn in life is to genuinely be ourselves, because that's typically what we are appreciated for the most, is for being who we really are. So there's that. Burning Man has instilled in me a deep sense of being civically engaged and really caring about our communities and having the belief that we can have an impact in what we create and what we see in the world. And so I'm very excited to have more burners who are running for office and getting engaged in politics and governance. I think that that's something very important, and the ethos that we bring, that's one of inclusion and caring for each other, is really important at this time.
Great answer.
So Rosie's a Burning Man adult and I'm a Burning Man infant, I think, is because the years, like, you've aged into, you get to do all the things. I'm still have my training wheels on. I went for the first and only time in 2016. And I think what struck me was like the question that I really sat with was, why can't this happen everywhere? Why can't we have this level of spontaneity, creativity, authenticity, and participation everywhere? And that really dovetailed and met with my understanding of like, oh, that's because the systems that we have, the systems that in some ways support this process of expression and participation, creation, and ability for people to like travel from all over the world and come together in this like remote desert, is actually the same system that makes Burning Man not possible everywhere else. And that is a like interesting thing, because it's like, oh, all right, cool. Like I want things to be accessible. I want things to be generative. I want people to have access to all of this creativity and unlock a lot of creativity. But realistically, we live in a kind of society that excludes that for a lot of people. And so what I'm really interested right now is like, how do we build the systems? How do we scaffold? How do we build, obviously, like Burning Man moving into projects like Fly Ranch and stuff is also starting to think about like, what does infrastructure mean? What does it mean to build something that you don't burn down? What does it mean to build something that sustains and supports people over generations or decades or even years? And those are all questions that I think that I still think about. They still inform what I do. I still want to understand how to get as many people to the table as possible. And it's like, all right, build a bigger table. What does that look like? What are the processes of building a bigger table? Just saying that we want a bigger table isn't far enough. It's just not. And so doing the kind of like legwork and supporting the people that already know about solutions but don't have access to them is I think a really like strong path forward.
Wow, yeah. You kind of started answering my next question about how our lessons can be applied to create the next paradigm and upgrade our life support systems for resiliency in the face of exponential change that we're seeing in regards to housing and food and energy and health and education. What are you doing right now to facilitate that transition, with the current state of the world, COVID-19, the upcoming elections, the ecological collapse, Black Lives Matter movement, the economic breakdown?
The meteor. No, I'm just kidding. Do you want to go first?
How about you go first this time?
Okay.
And Anna, can you make it so I can share my screen, because there's a couple slides I'd like to share after Ashoka's done.
Yeah, I think Ashoka might have to do it from his end. But...
Oh, Ashoka, you're in charge.
Oh, I am, huh? Let's see. Let's see, allow.
I think it's allow multiple options.
Co-host.
Great, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, it's a complicated question, right? Because the world that we want to exist in already exists and is already built. Like, it's already being built, it's already in process. It lives in every little moment of care that we extend to each other, and like synergy and symbiosis and mutualism, and ways that we understand that the future of our lives are interwoven with every being on this planet. That is the world as it exists, and that's the world that's always existed. That's the world that makes life on this planet possible. It's the reason life got even complex enough to us to have a video conversation on the internet in 2020. And those are the principles. And so what I find really interesting, like, I strongly believe that I was a tree at some point in my past life, and I actually came back from being a tree after being cut down because I had to figure out how to teach humans to stop cutting down my friends. But I'm super excited to go back to being a tree at the end of this whole shebang. But what I mean by that is observing the patterns that surround us and led to success will be huge and critical for us establishing success in our own human systems. Using what's abundant, providing care and shelter and nourishment for other people, forming deep networks, forming strong ties. Like, I don't know, look at a plant and look at its strategy, and that should be our strategy. Like, my understanding of the world is very biophilic, and it's hard for me to think about the systems that we build only in the context of ourselves as humans. And so what I'm really trying to understand is, how do we convey that to people? How do I convey to people that the system as it stands, the way to connect it and connect all the pieces, actually exists? And we have a lot of people working on a lot of those pieces. What they don't usually have is like sustainable funding and resources in order to build the capacity to provide care and services for more people. And are also usually the people that often experience some of the most trauma from the system that we have. Like, for me, like, my primary innovators are poor people. Like, I don't actually find rich people that innovative, because poor people have to deal with, like, how am I gonna like feed my children? How am I gonna like make rent? How am I gonna avoid the police in the street? And how am I gonna like deal with all these systems that are toxic to me? And they find a way. They survive. Like, that to me is ingenuity, and that to me is creativity. And so I see so many creative people in the world just like figuring out survival. And so I'm really interested in, how do we get resources to those people? How do we not stop coddling rich people as if they're first movers because they're second movers? And how do we get people to participate in the world that is already around them in meaningful ways? And that is what I'm really interested in right now.
I like it. Did you wear that shirt to be on brand with your past life?
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you went first, because it's going to dovetail perfectly into what I'm about to share.
Okay.
Okay, so I shared that I've gotten quite involved with Riane Eisler's work. Riane Eisler is now just about 90 years old, and for the last 45 years, she's been building a body of work called Partnerism. And she created this scale, which is called the Partnership Domination Social Scale. And this came out of looking at why, even though there have been some successes with capitalism in creating a middle class and creating thriving economies, even though in socialism, China was able to bring 1 billion people out of poverty, even in the midst of that, why have these two primary economic models failed us so much? Capitalism has created gross wealth inequality. It has devastated our environment. And socialism, Marxism, has come at the grave cost of human rights and also devastation of the environment. And so she looked at that and she said, okay, here's what's really going on. There exists this continuum. On one end is domination, and the domination systems, so whether it's capitalism or socialism, if you're oriented towards domination, what you have are in-groups at the top, who are the people in power, and you have out-groups, who are the folks at the bottom, and it's organized in a pyramidal hierarchical structure. And the folks in top keep the power and keep that structure in order by force and fear and violence towards the folks who are at the bottom. So this creates gross inequality, and it requires abuse of the people who are below, whether that's economic abuse, physical abuse, environmental abuse. One of the primary characteristics of domination systems is that it ignores the economic value of caring. So Ashoka mentioned caring for people. Right now, the majority of people who do the work of caring in the household are women, and it's been that way for millennia. And that work has been viewed as not productive work, and the economic term productive, but rather reproductive, and has been taken advantage of and taken for granted. And so in domination systems, that very first in-group and out-group, oh, hang on, there we go. The primary in-group and out-group that we're taught about as children is in the so-called quote-unquote traditional family, where the male head of household is the one who's in charge, who holds the economic power, and if you don't do what he says, you're going to be hurt. That's what we generally teach kids. And so in that, we teach them that men are superior and women are inferior. Given that the work of caring for the household, and if we expand that and look at our planet as our grand home, we can see that we don't value caring for our grand home, which is nature. So part of the issue with domination systems is that it also only accounts for part of our economic sectors. And I'll give you a brief overview of what that is here in just a moment. On the partnership side of the scale, rather than having in-groups and out-groups, everyone matters. Everyone is included. Everyone counts. And we do have some hierarchies. For instance, you have the hierarchy of a CEO and their staff. You have a hierarchy of parent and child, or teacher and student. But those relationships under a partnership system are relationships of caring, where we're working to help that person who's on the lower part of the hierarchy come up and actualize as a human being. Because of the focus towards care and equality, we see an increase in liberty and expression. And this for me is a part where I really see Burning Man as an example of this. I've had the really good fortune of spending a good chunk of my early career within the Burning Man organization, which was, when it became the entity that it is, well, it became the first version back in '97, it was founded by 3 women and 3 men. So equal partners. It is an organization that has a majority of women in leadership and management positions. it's an organization where I had the opportunity to learn from women who were very much in power. And so it has shaped my view of business and how things should go. So Burning Man, for me, ties into this. In partnership systems, we value the care of nurturing our young people. We value the care of nature. And what all this creates is human flourishing and creativity. And what we have to remember is that our economic systems are inventions. And they're inventions that were originally meant to support human beings, but we've gotten away from it as if the economy is this being that has to be fed itself rather than nurturing people. So I'm going to jump ahead here. Partnerism has a really big, long definition. In short, it is a socio-economic system that values the work of caring for people and nature. And it was coined by Rion Eisler. And you can go to partnerism.org to learn more information. I want to talk really quickly about why capitalism and socialism has failed us. And I mentioned the economic sectors. So currently what we account for in our economy are the market economy and the government economy. And then to some extent, we have a way of estimating the illegal economy. The sections that are ignored are those three pieces on the bottom, which is the unpaid community and the creative community economy. Those are the innovators. Those are the folks who create things like we do at Burning Man, where we create it for the passion of creating it. It's also the household economy. And then lastly, the natural economy. And these are the three life-sustaining sectors. And so under the partnerism economic map, we see those pieces included. So that's the gist that I want to give about partnerism. And I think I answered your question. Did I answer your question, Susanna, in my enthusiasm?
Yeah, you did. And I would like to go a little bit deeper about how partnerism, and I would like for you to talk about domination theory and how partnerism is a solution to mitigate the root causes that led to the current state of the world, specifically the oppression of Black people, and how partnerism can provide a solution forward to empowering those who are marginalized and often, put into cages to make us feel safe.
Right. I mean, all right.
Yeah, Ashoka, you can start.
Theory of the world.
Yeah, and I would love for you to talk about what this Black Lives Matter movement means to you.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that, but I will answer a related question. So yeah, like I think what's really important to realize about the world, and Rosie mentioned this, is like, it's all arbitrary. It's all been constructed over generations and millennium. Like all of the systems that humans use to operate, they're completely arbitrary. There's no natural law in any of them. There's no divine right. None of it really like has any basis in basically anything. It's kind of just like, well, we have a problem and we're going to try to fix it. And a lot of our history, unfortunately, is predicated and revolves around certain types of violence, and that's just the way it is. And like the culture that was created in Europe, like the papal bulls, which are like papal laws from the Pope, basically what you need to understand about the world happened within 30 years. Like at the first papal bull in this 30-year time span, the Pope gave Spain and Portugal the right to claim any peoples that it discovered on its journeys, and basically gave religious validation for slavery. And then 30 years later, they filed the papal bull for the for burning of witches and the decimation of indigenous culture in Europe. And so we essentially live in the shadow of these two kind of divine rights that were established. This idea that you could destroy women, specifically women who were engaged in medical or like wellness or health practices or alternative cultural storytelling, narrative, dancing, like wisdom keepers all over Europe were destroyed, right? also happened in the United States, in the early United States. And then you have the complete devaluation or subjugation of many types of life through the first papal bull, which was all about slavery. And so without destroying Black people and without destroying women, you don't get the world as it exists today. It doesn't look like this. It just wouldn't, it can't be this way. You can't create a country like America without the labor of the people, and you just don't have the cultural hegemony of patriarchy without the like fear that was caused by the idea that if you did something like even remotely like out of line, that someone could report you to the appropriate authorities and you would be burned alive. Like, to think about the ways that that sort of cultural dynamic tampers down the ability of people to express themselves and the ways that they internalize that fear. Like, I've had to unlearn generational fear. Like, the talks that I would get as a kid, the stories I would get as a kid of what my experience would be like as a Black man in America, and the things that I had to like be conscious of or cognizant of in my daily life, in ways that it got actually validated in my experience, created a dynamic where I didn't really fundamentally trust people. I still work on my trust of people. But it's interesting to recognize that my ability to express myself, my ability to trust people, and my ability to connect with others is all predicated on a deep history of violence. And like, my presumption or thoughts about that, like my presumptions or my thoughts about about those practices are actually even deeper than I recognize, because the trauma is so real. Like I gotta, like the example, like I was born in Los Angeles specifically because of lynching. Like, my grandmother, her uncle, and her father were both lynched at the same time. And her uncle lost his vocal cords because they had to go cut him out of the tree later because he didn't die from the lynching. And so in order to protect my family, my ancestors like fled the Midwest, basically, right? And so it's like these simple things where I can be like, hey, I'm from Los Angeles, is actually only because like my family was terrorized generations before. And so like, in this moment, if we don't centralize the reality that our society, our entire society, is predicated on violence against Black people and women, we will not change our society. Like, we can't do it. Like, those are the building blocks, those are the society Legos that we did. And so like, as Rosie said, like the domination that starts in the home, in the workplace, in the school, like, it's really funny being a democracy or calling ourselves a democracy, because I ask people all the time, I'm like, which of your relationships are democratic? Like, what is your relationship? Like, where do you get to practice democracy in your life? Where do you not have this relationship of authority over you in your major like decisions of your life? And I bring that up because I think about fractals a lot, and how do we create the little nuggets of what we want to do, and then be able to build them and scale them and affect all the people's lives and yada, yada, yada. But like, if we can't build democratic processes within our intimate relationships, we're never going to build a system or a society based on non-domination. It's just not possible. If you can't replicate what you're doing at the smallest scale, you can't replicate it at the biggest scale. That is what nature teaches us.
Here, here. Yeah, I wasn't expecting us to be so aligned in this conversation, Ashoka. I mean, frankly, I didn't have any expectations, but it's really amazing to hear you speaking these same things. The history of domination of the majority of humanity, which is women and children, dates back to between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. And when we talk about the so-called quote unquote traditional family model, where we have the male head of household that's highly punitive and authoritarian, that is a relatively recent development in the timeline of humanity. So if we look back prior to 6,000 years ago, which is approximately when patriarchy was invented, And patriarchy says that the women are owned by their fathers or they're owned by their husband. And the father or the husband has a financial claim on anything that the woman produces, including the children. So prior to that, what the actual tradition was in humanity, we have evidence, archaeological evidence of civilizations where this concept of partnerism existed, where there was equality between men and women, and where there was veneration of life and the ability to give life. So Rion's very first book, Rion Eisler, in 1987, she published a book that took her 10 years to research. It's called The Chalice and the Blade. And the chalice represents the woman or the womb, and that represents the ability to give life. The blade represents the male principle and a fascination with taking life and the ability to take life. When we look at examples, there's an archaeological site, a massive site in present Turkey. It's called Katil Hayak. When we look there, and when we look in Minoan Crete, which is Crete over in the Greek islands, we see examples in the art where we don't see any weapons. We don't see any scenes of violence. We don't see any scenes of war. What do we see? We see scenes of nature. We see scenes of moon cycles, sun. We see symbols that represent giving birth. And all of this was about affirming life and the sacredness of life and caring for life and stewarding life. With the invention of the Bronze Age, weapons came in vogue, and there were nomadic tribes that brought steel to come and dominate other cultures. And so it took time, but generationally, eventually those cultures that venerated life were subsumed. And I want to share with you this book. This is called Sacred Pleasure. This is also by Rion Eisler. The subtitle is Sex, Myth, and Politics of the Body, New Paths to Power and Love. This goes deep into religion and myth and narrative storytelling and how those were used to subjugate women so that men could rise to the position of power and do so through domination. So I highly recommend this book. If you want something a little shorter, because that's a 400-page tome, this is a book from 2019 called Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. This was came out last year. It's about 200 pages long. But this gets into the neuroscience, and it also encapsulates Rion's work from the last 35 years. So I highly recommend those books. The way that we move forward is by acknowledging that we need to be investing in children in a way that prevents trauma and harm to them. We need to be creating opportunities for women and seeing women as equal. We need to see men, and fortunately we're starting to see this trend of men sharing in the caregiving in the home, which is tremendously beneficial for the children because it teaches them that men don't have to be held to this rigid stereotype of being insensitive, unfeeling brutes, because that's not really who men are. And then we need to change our narratives, our stories. It's amazing to see in that book, Sacred Pleasure, she goes in depth into how myths in ancient Greece were taken and changed in such a way to make the mother relationship unimportant. So telling the Greeks that your relationship with your mom doesn't matter. And what actually matters is your relationship to the state. What matters is your relationship to men. And so these stories that we see of domination, I was on a master class a couple weeks ago with a very famous screenwriter, and my jaw dropped to the floor when some of the writers thought that their only responsibility was to entertain audiences, rather than recognizing the power and the responsibility that they have as someone who generates narrative that can reach the masses. So our storytelling is really important, and that's something that I'm starting to put some attention and focus on, is what does it look like to have a partnerism-oriented storytelling rather than a domination-oriented storytelling.
That's huge. Yeah, because like the mythos of the world we create is like everything, and it's super subtle. It's like, because yeah, the trick to convince people to turn life into money is like a very subtle neurological trick, because to be able to look at a forest and be like, well, that doesn't have any value to me, chop it all down, is a story, right? Like that is completely dependent on a story and a narrative and nothing else. And so it's wild to me how powerful Mythos is too right now, and how do we move away from the death cult myth? And that is like what I'm super interested in, because this idea of veneration of violence, of devaluation of life, of turning living systems into inanimate objects in order to consider them valuable, the way that we adorn ourselves with skulls and all sorts of things, like the ritualized violence that we celebrate, all of the ways that we have essentially just become a death cult, waiting for some like weird divine salvation, whether that be like a perpetual growth economy or like Jesus, like is part and parcel to the Western capitalist, like hegemonic patriarchal narrative. It's just what it is. And so it's really interesting to read the other stories, because one thing that death culture tries to teach us is that there is no other option. And it tries to create that as the reality by destroying every other option, right? Because if there is a logic that there could be another way, then death culture is less powerful because it's not the supreme ending, right? If it's actually regeneration and not linear, like ashes to ashes, dust to dust vibe, like what do we tell ourselves about that? And so like reading Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an amazing storyteller and talks a lot about indigenous wisdom of the North American tradition. She wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I highly recommend. But this idea of like restoring and understanding her story. And like one of the stories she talks about is the myth of Sky Woman that some indigenous people, specifically, like, I believe the Haudenosaunee, which she is a part of, is the idea of Sky Woman, and this idea that Sky Woman came to Earth and built Earth through relationships. And so the primary like life generator of their society is an immigrant, and that immigrant became indigenous through their relationships of care and understanding. And so that to me is like a pathway that we can move towards, like how deeply where you're indigenous to is where you're most deeply connected and where you care the most. And that's it. Like it doesn't need to be more complicated that. I think that like there is meaning all around us. There's story all around us. We just got to like turn the channel. We're just watching the same channel for way too long.
Wow, this is an incredible conversation, and Eamon was like trying to keep it light, but I think that these are really important conversations to be had at this critical point in time, and thank you both for going there. And you touched on my next question about how partnerism incorporates regenerative principles of living systems. If you have anything to add to that, Rosie, I would love to hear. And we keep talking about success, and I'm curious to hear what success looks like to both of you.
On the regenerative systems, so when we show that map of the puzzle pieces with the economy, and one section is the natural economy, what that represents is caring for nature. It represents valuing nature as it's intact and valuing the ecosystem services that nature provides. And there's a whole challenge around accounting for that kind of value. It's very difficult to assign value to a healthy, thriving ocean. But when we orient towards sustaining life, we can reinvent what our economics are. For instance, we need to get rid of GDP. Gross domestic product is problematic for the following reason. If there is an oil spill, the externalities of that oil spill, so it spills, then you have to pay to get it cleaned up, what parts you can clean up. The cleanup is accounted as a plus for economic growth, but it doesn't account for the devastation and the taking of life and the harm to life that accident caused. So what we need instead are, and there's a number of GDP alternatives that are great ideas, There's an additional one that we need, which is called the Social Wealth Index, and Rion's organization called the Center for Partnership Studies is putting this together now. The Social Wealth Index looks to measure the inputs of investing in the origin of high quality human capital, or our human capacity development. So when we invest in kids, we can look and see the outputs of that, such as higher educational attainment and literacy rates. There are all different kinds of metrics that we can look at to see how are human beings performing in their capacity, in their development to care for other people and for our planet. So I think that that's important, and regeneration ties into all of that. You had another question. I don't remember what it was.
It was about what success looks like to you.
Oh, yeah.
But before we go there, my other question, like to transition from what you just said to the next, my question was how domination theory has led to the extraction and exploitation of the planet, and how we can create a regenerative social system.
Yeah, that dates back to the 1700s. So when Adam Smith published The Real Wealth of Nations, and by the way, he wrote a
sleeper hit called The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Exactly.
All about capitalism not working unless people care about each other, but no one read it.
Well, so that wasn't about capitalism. He never called his theory capitalism.
Totally. I mean,
the theory
of market exchange.
The theory of moral sentiments. Moral sentiment was what we would nowadays call empathy. And so his work, he was a philosopher, a teacher of philosophy. And so his whole thing was that people are driven by wanting to belong and have empathy with each other. And his magnum opus was The Real Wealth of Nations. And in that, he talked about people are driven by self-interest. The way that I view that, and putting in the context of who he was in that time, I think of it as people are driven by self-care, not a selfish interest, but an interest in caring for themselves and family, make sure that they have what they need. Totally. So in that time, when in the 1700s, so that was 1776, that he published that book. In that time, women were considered the property of their fathers or the property of their husbands. So you have more than half of humanity who doesn't have the same rights. And again, taking care of the home was not considered, was not valued. And taking care of nature was not valued. Nature was there to be exploited and dominated. And so that is an underlying fault to capitalism, to the economic theory that Smith put forward. Fast forward to the early mid-1800s, we have Karl Marx. He writes the Communist Manifesto, and then later comes out with Das Kapital, which was where the word capitalism was invented. And so the same thing, women were still owned by their fathers or by their husbands. Same thing. Nature was there to be exploited. The care of the home was not valued. And so you can't have regeneration if you're not actually caring about your house. And the way that I really bring this home is I say, think about your home. If you didn't take the garbage out, you would be living in squalor. And who wants to live with that? Well, not very many people, unless you have super, super low self-esteem. But the point is that somebody has to take it out. It's a valuable task. I talk about caring for our planet in the same way, and that's why we should be caring about climate change as well. We don't want to be living in squalor. So those are my thoughts on regeneration domination systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how the myth of Adam Smith, like if you read the books, he doesn't support like most of the like rampant capitalism that we come to know and comes to, you know, like because of his like famous idea of the like invisible hand of the free market, and people like the market fundamentalist ideology ascribing to that and then just taking that part and not thinking about the second part of the book. And I think at the same time, like another fact was that you had enclosure, right? You had the destruction of the idea of the commons. You had that all property became, all land became private property. And that is really just an extension of patriarchal culture, right? Because if you are entitled to all of the wealth of your progeny from your daughters, then you better make sure you know who father that kid is, or like who's the kid of that father, and you make sure and you develop systems of monogamy so you can have like basically birth validity so that you can have the right dowries and like different things that are associated with marriage, right? And you have an entire system of control and rule scaffolded on these like relationships of intermarriages and like all the things that happen, right? And that's Europe. That's like how you're, that's like still Europe in some ways, which is really weird. But those processes have been exported. And so how do we recreate the commons, and how do we recreate the commons, alter our relationship to private property, and deal and value the type of work and labor that we want, right? Like for me, like I actually believe the opposite of ecosystems services. So here's a point that we don't agree on. I don't think it's valuable to value the Amazon. I think it's far more valuable to calculate the impact that we have as humans and put a price on that. So like, what is the negative, valuing the negative externalities of human systems is like far more what I'm interested in than trying to be like, what is the Amazon worth in money? Like that's, it's like the Pacific Ocean as like the lifeblood of billions of people. How much is it worth? It's like, you can't afford it. So it's like, doesn't, it's too rich for you. So let's,
you have to ask.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of abilities. I think the more that we untangle domination culture and untangle the relationships of fear, violence, and trauma, and how it affects our relationships to each other and the systems that we create, is the space and capacity with which we will develop regeneration.
Word. Great. Yeah, these are really good answers. In terms of ecosystem services, for those who might not know, can you define what ecosystem services are, Rosie? And
it's this idea that, and I have to agree with Ashoka that it's kind of absurd. It's very impractical. It's the idea that, it's the concept that you could put a dollar amount to the value that a clean river provides to an ecosystem, or that a national forest provides to a country, or that a sea provides to the countries that surround it. Like you can't quantify it, and it to my knowledge, it's been attempted, and it's very, very challenging to do. So I do like that approach that Ashoka was saying of accounting for the negative externalities. This is a really important distinction. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the externalities of something. Externalities are simply an unintended byproduct of a process. You can have positive externalities, which are beneficial to people, but the ones that are really important are the negative externalities. So those are all the unintended negative consequences that harm and take life.
I guess I'm curious about how people are participating in ecosystem services. For example, if people are working on regenerative agriculture that's restoring the health of the soil, and the health of the soil is providing value for the ecosystem that it supports, and then that value that people are adding to the ecosystem can be measured. Would that be considered ecosystem services that the people are?
I think, so I'm not an economist, so we're getting to the edge of my ability to talk about this. Full disclosure. I think that if you were to look at, okay, so let's say that I know of a farm up in the Hudson Valley that used to be used by a pharmaceutical company, and now it is being transitioned to an organic farm. So you could measure the abundance that is produced from that farm prior to, like this is where it gets so convoluted. You can measure prior to when the pharma company owned it. What did it produce? What was the abundance? You can look at things like what kind of birds were around in the ecosystem. Was there a decrease or increase in pollinators, in bees, butterflies, bats after the organic farm took over? Like, did the ecosystem become more vital? So you can choose what your different metrics are, and then say, did those things go up or did those things go down? But I think the real thing to be looking at is, what are the negative externalities? What is the negative impact of human contact and work in that particular area?
Fascinating. Well, we only have 5 more minutes left, and I would love to talk about how we can incentivize collaboration over competition, particularly for, restoring the health of our planet, on an ecological, social, and economic level.
Do you want to go first, Ashoka?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. So I'm working on this project called Tollo, which basically is the premise that if you take the time, you can develop a well-defined enough strategy to make meaningful impact on whatever issue you really care about. This project is specifically starting with food, energy, and housing because those are very impactful. But essentially what I understood was that like the energy system is pretty much solved by basically what we need to do. Like there's scientists out of Stanford who came up with a 50-state renewable energy plan by 2030. And so like we know the capacity limits we need, we know where we need to put it, we know who needs to be in control of it, like these sorts of things. But it's very hard for us to coordinate together to make that sort of action in ways that feels meaningful. Like me giving $20 or $100 a month isn't really going to make meaningful impact to an organization, but if we are able to figure out ways of like pooling that money and giving it to people to make meaningful difference at certain times and shining our, like taking all of our, I think of it as like each of us has like a little spray bottle basically, and we're all trying to put out the fire. But like if we all pointed to like one section and then did that together, we'd eventually put out the fire because of the cumulative effect of our water. Whereas if we're all trying different sides, like it may or may not work. But so the idea is, how do we develop the ability and capacity to pool people's resources and direct them to really strategically important initiatives, and give them feedback and understanding of like why we're making that strategy decision and how we're doing it. And so that is what I'm super interested in now, because I think a lot of people, I feel a lot of disengagement coming. It's like empathy fatigue, because it's too hard to care about all the things all the time, especially when you're not getting enough hugs because you're trapped in your house because of COVID. And so like, how do we balance the necessity to be like aware of everything at the same time with the ability for us to participate without necessarily being aware all the time? So finding the balance between those things, I think, is a really interesting space, and that is what I'm kind of working on. And I guess if anyone wants to have like further conversations with me, you can find me on Instagram at Life Supremacist, all one word.
Thank you, Ashoka, so much for joining us.
Okay, let's see. I have a lot to pack in here in 60 seconds. Incentivizing collaboration over competition. So human beings are inherently collaborative. There is tons of research on toddlers that proves that we are wired for sharing and caring. We are most satisfied when we get to share. We're most satisfied when we care. This whole idea of the selfish gene is part of that narrative that we are all out for ourselves, when in reality, the science of when we look at little kids doesn't match that. The selfishness and the competitiveness is something that we are taught. It's funny, I was talking about this with somebody today. I love competition when it's in the context of a game and we're playing it just for sport, and it doesn't matter who wins or who loses because it's just for fun. So if you ever play a game against me, I am.
You don't sound very competitive. I'm just gonna say that.
You wait and see. There's all kinds of trash talking. It's going to be like full on. And then when we get to the end, if I lose, it doesn't matter. It's just for fun. But if I win, I'm going to be like, sweet, I won. So one of the big issues that we have right now in this country is that there is a quote unquote battle for the soul of America. There are two Americas that exist. One is being told that on the far extreme conservative side, they're being told that America is being taken by the liberals. They're going to lose everything that America stands for. On the far left, we're being told that the Republicans are taking everything and the country's burning down. Part of the issue, this is the last book I'm going to promote tonight. It's called Foxocracy, Inside the Network's Playbook of Tribal Warfare. This was written by Tobin Smith. who spent 14 years as a paid commentator and co-host on Fox News. In this book, he talks about how Fox News was designed to be a propaganda machine. It was invented before the social media tools that we now have were out there. But once the targeted advertising and the algorithmic targeting that happens through Facebook and Twitter and the other social media platforms that has created a bubble that we each live in, once that was invented, we have 100 million people per month who are ingesting this content that in his book he calls, and I quote, white tribal identity activation porn. And so what this does is it feeds people information that tells them that they're under attack. And this is why we are seeing this huge schism in our country and an incitement to violence, is because the network does this for profit. And unfortunately, we're starting to see the more left-leaning news networks going in the same direction. They're catching on to this strategy as well. So we are being manipulated for profit on both sides. And the best thing to do is be aware that you are susceptible to manipulation through the social media that you use, and unplug yourself from that and find ways to contribute in your community. I think that that's the most important thing we can do right now.
Thank you so much. And I would like, thank you, Rosie, for joining us, and for both of you for sharing all of your wisdom and your insights.
Try harden ourselves up to the ones who died. Look in my eyes. Tell me the cost of the life that we're living.